Let's begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We give you thanks, Almighty God, for giving us this day to worship you and to honor you, and that the freedom you give us to practice our faith. We ask you to bless our conversation and keep us close to you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. This afternoon, I'd like to talk about three major events that take place today in our liturgy. I want to talk about what happened at the Chrism Mass and what's going to happen tonight at the Mass of the Lord's Supper. Okay? So the Chrism Mass, each three of these things celebrates a major event that happened on Thursday. Or at least two of them certainly happened on Thursday, and one of them is up for debate. So I'm going to start with the one that's up for debate. There are certain questions that everybody in the Catholic intellectual world posits happens at different times, and people hold on to this very, very firmly. One of those questions is, when did Jesus Christ institute the church? Was it at the Last Supper? Was it at Pentecost? Was it when the blood and water flowed from his sides? The reason I say this is very intelligent, very prominent theologians have answered that question with each of those answers. And to really pick one as opposed to the other is to either make a personal choice, which is fine, but you have to know that's a personal choice, or to be ignorant of the other possible moments. Okay. Another one of those questions is, when did Jesus Christ institute the priesthood? It would be easy to see if he had all the 12 apostles come forward and he laid hands on them and then he anointed them with oil, but he doesn't do that. One of the historical answers, and the day that the church celebrates the institution of the priesthood and the sacramental life of the church, is on Holy Thursday, because he gathers the 12 to share the Last Supper with them. The Last Supper was both a Passover meal and the first celebration of the Eucharist. So there is a connection between Holy Thursday and the Last Supper. One of the strongest answers for that is either the Last Supper because the apostles participated in the first Eucharist, or by the washing of their feet, that Jesus is ordaining them priests. That's a question I'm not going to answer because it's really not all that relevant. That's for people who really want to speculate, and we don't need to go that far. All we know is today is the day that Holy Mother Church chooses to honor the formation of the priesthood, specifically the parish priesthood. Okay. She does that with the Chrism Mass. The purpose of the Chrism Mass is to gather the local church to pray with their bishop. Two major things happen at the Chrism Mass: the renewal of the priestly promises from ordination, and the consecration and the blessing or consecration of the oils. The oil of the sick and the oil of catechumens are blessed. The oil of chrism is consecrated. And in fact, for the blessing of the first two oils, the bishop just says a blessing and makes the sign of blessing. For the chrism, though, he by hand mixes the perfume with the olive oil. And then during the consecration prayer, there's a moment where all of the priests in communion with their bishop extend hands over the oil, sort of communally consecrating it with their own prayers. Now, we don't say anything, we just sit there quietly. But the symbolism is very profound because the laying on of hands is in every sacrament, and it is an ancient sign for both the descent of the Holy Spirit and prayer. It actually doesn't need to be accompanied by any words because it itself is a symbolic action. Just like one doesn't have to shout, "Come here, come here, come here." Either the hand motion, "come here," means "come here," or the shouting would do it. Now, often we do that because people are not paying attention. But if the person is actually paying attention to us, we could just make the motion, and that would be enough. The Chrism Mass itself focuses on the collegiality of the priest with the bishop. That I, as an ordained priest, only have certain powers I have by the right of my ordination. So I could celebrate the Eucharist if somebody was dying. I can anoint people who are dying. I can confessions for people who are dying. I can baptize and confirm people who are dying. Ordinarily, a priest has no powers on his own except for those that I just talked about until the bishop delegates him responsibilities. So that comes in the form of a parish assignment. I am assigned as the parochial vicar to St. Genevieve. My authority I share in the vicarious assignment of the pastor of St. Genevieve. Now let's pretend for a moment that St. Genevieve didn't have an administrator and instead we had a pastor. So Father Eric is our pastor. I would share it. I would be a vicar of his power, of his responsibility. But he ultimately has all the responsibility for everything that takes place in this parish, because that's been delegated to him by the bishop. And that gives him rights that he would not have had if he was not the pastor of this parish. Okay? Currently, he's the administrator, which de facto makes the bishop the pastor of the parish. But that doesn't change anything in regards to my authority. Each priest receives a set of faculties, and those faculties enumerate the powers and responsibilities he might have. So one of those is to witness weddings in the parish I'm assigned to, and to delegate that responsibility to other people. I can't on my own go and just pick a church and do a wedding at that church. I have to get permission from that church's pastor, who's been given that power from his bishop. So all of our authority flows from the bishop. And then, just as a reminder of this all the sacraments that the priest performs is by virtue of the action already done in Jesus Christ. So that when I say the words of absolution, that what the person is experiencing is Jesus Christ through me hearing those words of absolution. Okay. On Holy Thursday night, at the Mass of the Lord's Supper, the only thing that's different than other Masses, well, when the gifts are brought up, the oils that were consecrated during the day are brought up. But more importantly, after the homily, a number of people, depending on the parish. So here at St. Genevieve, 12 people will come up and be stationed in front of the sanctuary, and they will have their feet washed. Now, this goes back to the event that happens at the beginning of the Last Supper. Jesus is gathering with his disciples for a Passover meal. Except he does three things very differently. The first of which he does is that he stoops down, takes off his outer garment, puts on an apron, grabs a bucket of water, and washes the apostles' feet. Now, this is famously something that's very degrading. Like, even you ordinarily, like a person would wash their own feet, because you couldn't even make the slaves do it. That's how degrading it was considered in the extremely modest society of ancient Judaism. So Jesus Christ, the Lord and Master of all, as the Scripture says, bends down and washes the feet of his disciples, showing a profound humility. And he says after that, "What you have seen me do, you also do. That I come not as the one to be served, but as the one to serve." Now, here's what that means for the apostles. They are gathered around the rabbi, the teacher that they followed for however many years at this point, 3 years. And I can't imagine what goes through the mind of Peter and Paul and James and John. And the one I really struggle with is what's going through the head of Judas as the master bends down and washes their feet. The thing that is incredibly socially unacceptable. And what Jesus is showing them is that what I do, I want you to do. He says this. What he's showing them is that there is no point so low that I won't stoop to if it's going to save you or save everybody else. And so he's willing, as the teacher and master, to put aside his honor and pride and do what is helpful and right and good for the apostles. And that he does this out of love. That this immensely demeaning and degrading action, not that I think Jesus really, he would not have been shocked by this at all, because he proves that again and again and again throughout his life, that he has no care for social custom. But he is very much aware of the impact it has on other people. And he puts that aside to wash the feet of the disciples, and then instructs them to do likewise as they would go forward, which they would do, because it's part of our liturgy. That's to say, in a literal way, that we have followed the words of Jesus Christ even to today. Even when he means something spiritual and something theological, that you would go forward and nothing would be below you, and you would serve your brothers and sisters. All of those theoretical results of the washing of the feet are accompanied by the fact that on Holy Thursday, we still get together and physically wash the feet of the disciples. Now, what are we actually seeing on Holy Thursday? Because I think it's really important. It's an important question to ask. Because what we're not seeing is, we're not participating in the Last Supper. It's not a sacrament. It doesn't pierce through time and space. What we're doing is we're reiterating what Jesus told us to do. It's not the same apostles getting their feet washed. God bless them, because that means one of them would have to represent Judas. That's not what's happening. But instead what is happening is a new generation of Christians is having their feet washed to help everybody focus on the reality that is going to happen. Now, what this means is, for us, is that we would go out and we would serve our brothers and sisters. Now, this is going to mean something very concrete and special for you guys. When I was in the seminary, reflecting on what my life as a priest was going to be like in the future, one of the things that always caught me sort of off guard was the reality that at some point I'm going to be called to minister to other priests. Ministering to people who are not priests is duh. And that's basic. That is literally what you're ordained to do. But having to reflect on and come to terms with the fact that the priest ministers to the whole church, which includes all the brother priests in the same diocese, that priest's bishop, all other bishops, all the other priests of the world, and how important it is for us to minister not just to those who we're responsible for, because clearly that is your responsibility, but how you would minister and work with those who are your peers in the ministry, to be open and willing and to hear the confessions of brother priests and not to be disappointed. Now, that's how this impacts my life. Now, this is going to impact your lives in ways that are different, because you're clearly called to teach the youth, the young ones. But in the same way, you're going to walk amongst a certain faculty that you have to live and you have to love each other. I mean, you don't have to like each other, but you do have to love each other. And that means things like have each other's back. You know, when somebody's getting stressed out, you don't have to fix them, but just remind them, hey, look, you may need to take a deep breath. Not everybody's going to be open to that. Sometimes it's going to take a moment of having to, this is not going to be received well, but it needs to be said. Swallow your pride and go talk to that person and have that difficult conversation. We're not doing what the apostles were told to do when we run away from what is difficult with our peers. Sometimes it means you're going to have a difficult conversation. Like things like, you can't schedule an exam the day we get back from the Easter holidays. Now, of course, the students don't want that because that is crazy. And you guys don't want to schedule stuff before the Easter holidays because that means you have to grade it over the holidays. But to be able to have that courage to go up to another brother or sister who's teaching the same school as you and to have a difficult conversation. Maybe, hey, you know what? The students are afraid of you, but not in a good way. Or maybe they're not afraid of you in a bad way, and you need to be more forceful, or however that works, so that you would learn to wash each other's feet in your very lives. Now, what that looks like concretely is going to change rapidly on a daily basis. I can tell you this. There was if you've ever read The Story of a Soul, the autobiography of Thérèse of Lisieux, a little Carmelite nun. She only lived to be 24 years old. She died of tuberculosis in the convent in France. But she's a doctor of the church. She added something to understanding of Catholic spirituality that did not exist previously. In her journal, in her autobiography, she tells this story of an event where there was a nun who was washing clothes with her, whom she realized everything that this sister did irked her. Just everything she did was just imperfect, and it ate her up on the inside. And I think that part we can all come to understand. But what was important was, and she tells us this in her autobiography, she had determined that she would love that sister even in all of her imperfections. She would not care, she would not correct her because it didn't need to be corrected. It was just an imperfection that irked her. So she would swallow her pride and learn to love this sister who irked her. What's important is that when Thérèse finally passed away, when she dies, the custom among the Carmelites is that the closest friend of the sister who dies goes into that sister's cell and collects all of her things so that they can be distributed amongst the remaining sisters. But one of the key things that they would do is they would read the deceased sister's journal to see if there was a cause for canonization in their life, which I'm sure Therese, they were like, oh, go do it, because this is going to be a slam dunk. Famously, when everybody wants to know who the sister is, because in the story of the soul, Therese doesn't say who she is. All everyone knows is that there is a sister that she couldn't stand, that she focused on loving that particular sister. Well, they read the journal, and the best part of all this is that the sister who's her best friend who's reading the journal is the sister she could not stand. And that in her love for that woman, in her desire to love this woman, even when she irked her, it was indistinguishable from true and authentic and deep friendship. And in fact, from her decision to love this person who irked her, she had developed a lifelong friendship. That's the kind of washing each other's feet that Jesus Christ calls us to. Okay. We are making wonderful time. This may be the first time in my life I've actually stayed on a timeline. Okay. The last thing that happens on Holy Thursday is, so Jesus Christ gathers the disciples in the upper room and he does three things that are different. The first is that he washes the feet of the disciples. The second one is that through the course of the Seder meal, he gets to this point where presumably he was supposed to be eating bread. But instead, he takes the unleavened bread, he blesses it, gives thanks for it, and then says, take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, give it up for you. He breaks it and distributes it among the apostles. And if the foot washing didn't key them off he's doing something different, this definitely did. Because you don't change the script to the Seder meal. It's not set in stone, but it's set by the leaders of the day. And so Jesus, as an individual rabbi, would not have done something different unless, as the Messiah, he was instituting something new, which is what he does. Then he takes a chalice, presumably at the part of the meal where they're supposed to consume some of the wine. Now, famously, the Seder meal, done correctly, has either 5, 7, or 9 chalices. I can't remember off the top of my head. And cups of wine. Now, that's not 5 times you sip from a cup of wine. That's 5 times at least that you drink a glass of wine. So, it's a big deal. Now, presumably at one of these times, he takes the cup and says, take this, all of you, and drink from it, for this is the cup, this is the chalice of my blood, that would be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in memory of me. Thus begins the first experience of the sacrament of the Eucharist. So Jesus Christ distributes this bread and this wine amongst the apostles and says to them 2 different times, this is my body, this is my blood. Consume this. Now, we could go super deep on what this means because there's a lot of places to go. I think one of the places of primary importance with the Eucharist is understanding that eating the flesh of a sacrifice was common in Judaism. I think we tend to think that the Jews they brought their goat to the temple and then they left with no goat. That's actually not what happened in the majority of the sacrifices. Now, the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, they burned an entire bull, two actually. But when you would come to offer your free will offering at the end of the harvest or the beginning of the harvest, the priest would take a portion of that, and then the rest of you had to eat before the end of the day. So when you go to offer something in the temple, it was not taken and then burned in a fire. Some of them were, but most of them, a portion of that would be taken to sustain the life of the priest because they were not allowed to work outside the temple area, and that was how they fed themselves. That was how they got paid, was this sacrifice. But then you were instructed to consume the rest of it. So you'd bring your first fruits to the temple, and then the law of Israel was that you would feast. Now, Cajuns have never needed a law to be told when to celebrate and when to feast. But God does this, and it's really important, because what's offered is taken, blessed by God, and given back to you better because it is a sacrifice from God. And then you consume it right away. So that's what Jesus is doing with this. He's taken this bread, lifted it up, blessed it, consecrated it, and made it better, and handed it back to the apostles with something much more powerful than what they gave. Now here's the catch. The Jews were not only, did they not drink the blood of the sacrifices, they were forbidden to drink any blood. Because blood in Judaism, is the life force of the body. And in Israel's law, in the Old Testament, God clearly says, blood is for me. So you would offer the sacrifice of blood. Now, whether or not that had to do with other pagan sacrifices, and that was the way God was ripping them away from the pagan cultures around them, is a whole other discussion we don't need to go into. What's important to remember is that God has reserved the blood for himself. So that something very profound happens when God and Jesus Christ offers to the apostles the blood of a sacrifice. Because what he's inviting them into is divine life. When God hands you something that has always been reserved to God, what he's saying is, like, I want you in my family. Like, you and me will be the same now. Or connected in such a way that what is reserved for me is now reserved for you. The Eucharist has three functions. It nourishes the body. Actually, it nourishes the soul. It has the same functions as food. So, namely, the Eucharist, the way you would eat food to grow strong, you receive the Eucharist in order to spiritually grow strong. In the same way that one might eat food to acquire good health, you eat the Eucharist to keep yourself from spiritually getting sick. There's a communal element to the Eucharist that when one eats, one generally, although I enjoy this quite a bit, you generally don't eat alone. You eat with other people, at the very least, your family, if not friends gathered around this meal, so that we come together for the Eucharist. So there's this power of joining with us to join other people together. And then lastly, I think what's really profound, and sometimes we pass it up, the purpose of eating food is so that it nourishes your body, and the food becomes part of your body, becomes one with your body. In the Eucharist, something similar happens, but it's actually in reverse. Usually what is consumed is assimilated into the thing that consumes it. But with the Eucharist, the consumer is assimilated into the thing consumed. So, not that we lose who we are when we receive the Eucharist, not at all, but that we become unified with God in receiving the Eucharist. So on the most basic level, what this event that Jesus does at the Last Supper does is it gives us this thing that we now participate in that we did not participate in previously. We have the Eucharist. This is not a yearly remembrance like the washing of the feet, but a daily one, that the Eucharist is offered every single day. It's not celebrated on Good Friday. We'll get to that on Friday, but it is offered every day to all those who have been fully initiated that come to receive it. Lastly, although this is more what happens tonight, after the Last Supper, Jesus Christ does one last thing that is different than all other Seder meals. He does the bread and the wine liturgy, ritual, or whatever the apostles would have called it. And then the meal progresses, and then at some point they sang a hymn, and then they went off. Now, what we tend to get back from, what we tend to see in this is, what it looks like happens is, Jesus completes a portion, the majority, but a portion of the Seder meal, of the Passover meal. And then he stands, and all the apostles, they stand up with him, and he leaves. Now, it's difficult for us to understand what this might feel like, but imagine if a priest were to consecrate the Eucharist, put it on the altar, and then leave, and expect all of you to follow to go pray in the garden chapel outside of Mass. How strange and different that would be, because it would so break it would so break the ordinary flow of things. Now, what he's doing is he's extending this Passover meal to the next day, because it's not going to be complete until he is just about to die on the cross. And they hand him the wine-soaked sponge, and he one of the Gospels says that he drinks it and then says, "It is completed," signifying that his sacrifice on the cross is completed, and that this last Passover, celebrated not by the people of Israel but by the Messiah himself, is complete. And so that what the Passover was meant to signify and to point towards has actually happened in the Passover meal. Those are the three things that Jesus does differently on the Thursday night with the Passover meal than you would expect with other Passover meals. So, on Holy Thursday, Jesus gathers with the apostles in the upper room. They celebrate a Passover that's a little different than usual. He will then go out into the Garden of Gethsemane. He will go to pray. Famously, he will shed drops of blood in his sweat. The tension and the pressure in his heart is so great. He will sort of bargain with the Father and ask that the difficult things that God is asking him to do, this Father's asking him to do, might be taken from him, but if not, that the will of God should be done and not himself. He goes into the garden. He will be confronted by Judas the betrayer and the guard. He will be taken in being arrested. He'll be brought to the high priest Caiaphas. He'll be interrogated there. And most importantly, he'll be imprisoned. Now, imprisoned in ancient Jew, I've been in the room that they say Jesus was imprisoned in. Now, this is the way. It's important to recognize when you go to Jerusalem now, in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, the Romans flattened everything. And some of the sites, when they built them back up in the hundreds of years after that, some of them going like, well, this is where we think this happened. And some of them, it's a little easier. Like there's one olive grove on the side of the mountains. Like, that has to be the Garden of Gethsemane. That one was a little easy. But this is where Jesus fell. How do you know that? So I've been in the room where they say Jesus was held. It's an underground cave. The way that in the Middle East where you would keep prisoners, because it was all about how cruel you could be, was that you would lower them into a cave and then fill the cave with enough water that they had to stand while they were in the cave. So Jesus is arrested in the middle of the night. He's quietly taken to the Sanhedrin after all these other people have had their 7 cups of wine and tried. And then he's imprisoned for the rest of the night. That is why after the Mass of the Lord's Supper, Jesus, the Eucharist is taken out of the church and brought to an altar of repose. That's connected to the Garden of Gethsemane. But then it's locked. At midnight it's locked, which is more about his imprisonment and begins the events of Good Friday. That's how Thursday and Friday connect to each other. So let's stop there and open the floor. Do you guys have any questions, comments, difficulties?
Talked about Saint Therese Lisieux and how she specifically loved the person who loved her the most,
Mm-hmm.
and that we are called to do that when it's really difficult. How do you do that? Other than just continuously praying for that person and reminding yourself? I mean, is there
I think the most important reflection there for us is St. Paul writes about this event where he has this thing in his life that's irritating him. And the way that comes to us is, I had this thorn in the flesh, an angel of Satan to beat me. And I asked the Lord 3 times that it be taken away from me. And God says, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made known in weakness. So St. Paul has this thorn in the flesh, the famous event. A thorn in the flesh makes me think of something that physically irritated him, but an angel of Satan to beat me makes me think of some interior temptation or vice. we don't know exactly what Paul is talking about. I think the presumption is that everybody who's reading this letter when Paul writes it knew what he was talking about. And so he didn't feel the need to specify. But the way it comes to us now is we have no way to recover that, which is a blessing because it means you can insert whatever bothers you into that spot. But Paul has this thing that's going on in his life that's irritating enough that he thinks it's impacting his ministry. And he prays for God that this thing that irritates him would be taken away. And God's response, very simply put, is no. Not even like I'm sorry, bro, but like I need you to do this for me. It's just no. The reason is that my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made known in weakness. Now that's two different things. The first part is more about if I'm allowing this to happen to you, I'm supplying you with the grace to go through it. Now, does that mean that you will succeed? Does that mean that you will not get angry? Does that mean that you will be graceful for the whole thing? No, because that's not what success for God means. But I've given you, my grace is sufficient for you. The second thing that he says is, my power is made known in weakness. So when you're trying to love that person who's really irksome and it's really hard, good. That is when it is most valuable. That doesn't mean it's easy though. And that those would be the opportunities where God is actually leaving this thorn in your flesh so that you would call out to him and ask for assistance. And so that you would know that when you do survive, it is by the grace of God and not by your own power. That's the best answer I have. The next best answer is recognize, this is more practical than spiritual, recognize you're not going to change that person. God changes hearts. People change because they realize disconnect in themselves. We do not change people. You can be the agent of change, but you can't force somebody. And you guys as teachers know more than anybody else on the whole planet, if somebody refuses to understand something, you cannot make them understand it. You can rephrase what you said in a different way. You can make it the easiest way for them to understand it. But if they can't make that intellectual jump, they're not going to get there on their own. So that being the case, what can you control? If you can't make somebody change, if you can't change somebody else, you know who you can change? You. So if I can change myself, here are the things I might work on. Number one, is the thing that irritates me in that person actually them? Or is it actually bad? Because sometimes we're irritated by things that we ought to let go of. Sometimes we're irritated. I notice this in myself. The thing I dislike about myself is the thing that irritates me the most in other people. And so by recognizing that, I can have more patience with these other people. Another thing that you might do is like, is there a vice in my life that I might work to reduce? So our irritation with other people is often, it's really not about what they're doing. It's really not that bad. But here's the best example I can give you. Who's ever cut somebody off in traffic? I presume it's most of us. Even if you're not raising your hands, it's okay. We're all in the same human family. Better question. Who's ever been cut off in traffic? Okay. Who's thought when they got cut off in traffic, that low-down lowlife did that on purpose to upset me and put me in danger? Okay, I've thought that at the very least. The problem is that it's completely irrational. I have never, in full will, cut somebody off in order to irritate them, unless they were my friend, and then it's not really even the same thing. I've never done that because it's super dangerous, but I've been in the car with friends who are high school students, and I don't want to name names because some of you have taught these people, and especially when the second guy has bad brakes, like, don't do that. Okay. If you've never cut anybody off to irritate somebody else, we've got to presume at least as much in the other people. That nobody's ever cut you off. Now, why would they have done that? Because they weren't paying attention, they needed to make the turn, they thought that they were more important, whatever, it doesn't matter. Even when they did it on purpose, they didn't do it to personally hurt us. So that means the things that other people are doing that irritate us, number one, they may not know that it's irritating, which is where those hard conversations come in. So like, hey bro, you got to brush your hair, and hey bro, you got to brush your teeth, and hey, you probably want to take a shower. These are all the conversations we have to have with first year seminarians, because they've never lived in a building with 80 other people before, or change the toilet paper, wash your clothes, things like that. You can't leave your clothes in the laundry machine and go to Texas. All of that being the case, a lot of times it's the way I feel offended is why I'm irritated. So if we can try to understand the other person better, if we could put aside our own pride, we'll get more out of ourselves. It doesn't mean that the thing the person is doing is not irritating. Because here's how you figure that out. You go, no, this is not the best thing to do because it turns into gossip very easily. Okay, this keeps happening. So-and-so. Like, so-and-so keeps walking in the middle of my conversation and cutting me off. Do you feel that? And the other person goes, yes. That's how you know it's a problem. That's how you know it's not just you. And then that gives you grounds, not to go to that person and like triple team them and go, hey, you need to stop doing this. But no, walk up and say, hey, you know what? I've noticed this keeps happening. And when it happens, it's really frustrating for me. Not that they're bad, but the impact of their actions on my life is bad. And again, a lot of times, you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know, and you don't know when you're irritating people until they let you know. Now, it's not fun because nobody likes to be corrected or told them that, oh, you're the bane of my existence, even though they may very well be. But to have the courage to have those conversations. So Peter, at washing of the feet, tells Jesus, Lord, Lord, you will not wash my feet. And Jesus says, Peter, you don't do this, you have no part of me. And then Peter says, well then fine, Lord, if you're going to wash my feet, wash my neck and my head as well. And Jesus says, relax, Peter. I know what I'm doing. This is enough for now. Okay? So we even have to have this, because if Jesus did want to fight with Peter, he could have said no. Okay, fine. Don't have your feet washed. But then he would have left Peter not having any part in the kingdom of God. Or he could have said, okay, I'll dump the whole bucket on you and you wash as much as you want. But that wasn't what was necessary. So Jesus, in his charity, gets Peter to do what is the right amount. And that we should at least extend to other people. Okay. Anything else?
I apologize because you guys weren't here yesterday, but I struggle with something that you talked about last night. You were talking about our thoughts, our feelings, our desires, and I can really kind of relate it to you because you said, you really think a lot. You're much more of this. You focus on the intellectual, the feelings either get neglected and I've spent a lot of my life really kind of just building these walls to start tearing down this stuff, is really what I'm searching for this week.
Okay.
And so, I was sharing with Michelle, I did the imaginative prayer last night.
Okay.
I've got a picture of the Pieta in my house and, pity the woman. And that was very powerful. But, just to connect with this incredible sorrow, but it's really tough to just get back with the living, to get back with people who really feel, really are impacted by the sorrows of the world, or
So the way I want to respond to that is first with a little pop psychology and then with some actual philosophy and theology. Recognize that a lot of that is a defense mechanism. So psychologically, that's what's happening. One of my heroes, I've not read a lot of his stuff, but is a guy named Dietrich von Hildebrand. He was a German philosopher, psychologist, who was the #1 most hated person by Adolf Hitler, which gotta mean he was an amazing person, because Hildebrand would publish stuff countering Hitler. Hildebrand was a German Catholic who said, look, if truth is truth and all truth is true, then the truth from one discipline in life should apply to the truth, or at least speak to the truth in another discipline of life. So what he did was he went to study the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and to apply it to his study of psychology in the human person. And one of the most important things that he's contributed to the world is the idea of effective, with an A, affective maturity, that I'm mature in my affect. This is important because somebody who very, very, very much appreciated him was John Paul II. And this deeply impacted a lot of what John Paul wrote and said as the Holy Father. The biggest impact he had on my life is The program for priestly formation, which governs the formation of priests in the United States, is founded based on the document called Pastores Labo Vobis by John Paul II, which was this, well, everything John Paul did was massive, but it was this massive writing he did on the formation of priests. And the majority of it was devoted to effective maturity. And so that the person who is an effectively mature man can be a good priest. You need a good foundation. You need good foundation in nature for grace to build upon. And so, you hear that in the seminary and just like your eyes roll because you hear it 50,000 times your first year. The core of effective maturity is that a person lives enriched by their emotions, but not dominated. So the problem is we interact with the world and bad things happen. And so the way we respond to that is what psychology calls a defense mechanism. One of the ones that is talked about the most in sacred scripture is the hardened heart. And this is a heart that gets hurt by the world and turns inward and doesn't want to feel. Now, a lot of times people who are intellectual will retreat to a place in their mind where they can safely and easily dissect everything that happens so that we can rationalize everything that would make us change. And it is a form of intellectual cowardice because I don't want to deal with that. Now I'm talking about myself. It's what's important to recognize. This is the reflection of a person who did this to greater or better, bigger or less degree. Not that I feel like it was ever emotional, because I got pretty angry, but just that my emotions were not always healthy. If that being the case, any one of those things, either the passions, our emotions, or our will, our desires, or our intellect, can be a place where we go to find safety to the exclusion of the other two. And it's a shortcut that actually limits our freedom. I don't know exactly what it's like to have a person that's dominated by their will. I don't even think that exists. That may not even really exist at all. With the person who's dominated by the emotions, we know that's wrong. That's very clear. And we see the person who has no emotion. Because the problem with no emotions is that we can lack empathy. And that is disastrous to the Christian life. So, walking through that, the first step is God knocks on our heart and shows us the place where we need to work. And taking those first steps of saying, okay, maybe for the first time in our lives, I'm open to this. I'll go. I know it's going to be painful. That's a massive move in the right direction. Don't expect yourself to be different overnight. I say this to people who come to confession and they complain about, I am a control freak, or I have massive anxiety. And I tell them, okay, there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those who never plan anything, and those who have to plan every second of their day. And just like there are introverts and extroverts, these people find their virtue and their holiness in doing the opposite. Now, the person who micromanages their whole day is never, ever, ever, ever going to have to worry about being completely a mess. They're actually incapable of that, because being disorganized eats them up on the inside so bad that but what they're going to do is they're going to find their virtue in resisting the desire to always be in control. And in the middle, they're going to find their virtue, because they can live in a world where they're free from things like perfectionism. It doesn't need to be perfect. You don't want to slide into it. It just has to be good enough. But at some point, it's got to be good enough. It's got to go to print. Other people, it doesn't matter. You have the deadlines. You have this concrete reality of the world around us. It can't always be perfect, but also to always strive for excellence and do the best you can. So that is often a lifelong encounter for many people. Honestly, we're all messed up. The thing is, our messed up is different.
I didn't think I was messed up.
No. So if each of us is messed up, the thing is, the way we're messed up is different. So some of us struggle with being more emotionally involved. People like to. It's amazing that I'm enjoying this. People, every time I talk to somebody about the story of the soul, they're like, "It's so ooey gooey and gushy and emotional." I'm like, "Yeah, I can understand somebody whose emotions are overflowing." We actually appreciate. I think we appreciate each other. The person who was really struggled to feel can really appreciate the person that struggles to not feel. And so Therese writing as her mature 23-year-old self, which is awkward to say, but that was the oldest she ever was, is writing about what she was like when she was 4, 5, 16, whatever, and she recognizes I was a brat. She'll say that about herself, or she'll say things like I knew I was too emotional about this, or I knew I was too naive. I didn't know what it was like to not be naive, but I knew I was being too naive. And I think at the end of our days, if we can recognize when we're doing something out of our fear and anxiety, we're light years ahead of somebody who can not do it but is not aware. So that's the best I have for the 2-minute version of that. There is a retreat in, now that I think about it, in Florida called Healing the Whole Person that deals with some of these issues. The whole focus of the weekend is, okay, what are your personal hang-ups and how is Jesus Christ coming to bring healing and freedom to that in particular? And so people who thought they were never going to have breakthroughs in their healing have, people like me, we go in and we're like, oh, I never really had anything too bad happen to us. And then you start talking with these guys and they're like, oh no, I'm a mess. Like my whole life is torn open. I can see how my really good parents messed me up. My parents were really good and they still failed me. And that, now the important thing is that you're going to do that to your children too.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, mine's screwed up.
It's fine. It's because we're human. But and then other people walk in and maybe they've been depressed for years and they've gone to spoken to counselors, they've spoken to spiritual directors for years, and they've never dealt with the causes. They've dealt with the symptoms. You go to Alcoholics Anonymous, and Alcoholics Anonymous will give you ways to deal with your issues, but it also gives you new behaviors. But if the alcoholic never deals with what drove him to alcohol, Alcoholics Anonymous can't help him. If he doesn't want to be better, well, same thing with your psychologist. If you or anxiety medicine or anti-depression medicine, like that only helps you as much as you are willing to deal with what causes the anxiety or causes the depression or causes the whatever. Now some psychological issues are more or less physiological, like you just take the medicine and oh, I'm not running 1,000,000 miles per hour. This is what it feels like this is what everybody else feels like when they wake up in the morning. Or I feel really, really laid, really low, and you take that medicine and it brings you up, and all of a sudden I've never felt this good before. But a lot of our psychological conditions have a mixture of physiology and actual psychological, we're reacting to the world in a bad way. And just like you would teach a child not to stick a fork in an electrical socket, we have to sometimes be taught, hey, you can't just walk up and bust in somebody's conversation like that. That's really rude, even though it doesn't seem rude to you. You have guys at the seminary you can't argue about everything. Or, hey, you have to talk to people. Try it. You might like it. All of these things come up just because we don't have any life coaching. We have coaches that will teach us how to throw a baseball correctly, or how to I wanted to use a hockey stick, but that's not even a local sport. How do you swing a baseball bat correctly? How do you run the correct route? And all of those things, but we don't have people to go how do you talk to people well? And not how do you stand in front of a crowd and talk to them well, but how do you go up to your friend and talk to them such that they're not weirded out? And a lot of that life coaching and mentoring, you either get it or you don't get it. And the beauty is that if you didn't get it from your parents, fine. Go study. Go research. God, our parents were always going to fail us. You were always going to fail your children. That's okay. Let go of that. Everybody's real father is their father in heaven, and everybody's real mother is the church. So if that's the case, the things we didn't get from our parents, we're supposed to go get that from God and from the church. Okay. So that was a really long answer to that question. Anything else? Okay. Tonight is the Mass of the Lord's Supper. I suggest you go to that at your church. Ours is at 7 tonight. And practice is at 5. So I have to wrap this up so that I can take a break and get my head in order before we teach the kiddies, make sure they don't, burn down the church and stuff like that. It would be good tonight to spend some time with the Passion account for the things that happen on Thursday, especially Thursday evening, and just don't forget the try and experience as much silence as you can, and try and get your 30 minutes of prayer in as best you can. Tomorrow, our first, section 1. So just for you guys who didn't join us yesterday, tomorrow I have 2 conferences scheduled, but they're repeats of each other. So you can come to either one. It's going to be the same material. The idea being that if you want to go on the hike for Christ, you can go at Christ the Redeemer, and then just join us for the conference at 6. If not, I have the conference in the morning, which
10.
10? Okay.
Yeah.
10.
10 a.m. and 6 p.m.
Yeah.
I'm taking a poll on who's coming when.
Oh, I'm coming in the
Jared's
morning.
home tomorrow. I'll be here at 10.
Yeah, and there were some other people that said they were only going to be here for Friday or Thursday, or so. And there's going to be a revolving door of people through the whole weekend, but
Yeah.
that's the nature of Holy Week, with people who have young children, stuff like that. I think that's it. So let's pray. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be, world without end. Amen.